Prepared and presented by the Adult Education Council of Chattanooga in cooperation with WDEF Radio and Television as another service to the community. And now, here is your moderator for today.
America's enemies are using false issues like poverty and racism to confuse and divide us. This is the basic contention of one of our guests today. On the other hand, poverty and racism are themselves the dividers of this nation. This is the contention of one of our other guests. Good afternoon. I'm Booker T. Scruggs, and welcome to Point of View as we discuss the real revolution in America. On my left, I would like to introduce Mr. Charles Smith, who is a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and more recently from the Watts community of Los Angeles, California, and who is in Chattanooga as a member of the Speakers Bureau of the John Birch Society. Mr. Smith spoke here in Chattanooga on last Thursday evening. Also, we have with us the Reverend Leroy Griffith, pastor of the Church of Reconciliation, and who has participated in various civil rights activities, both locally and in other parts of the country. We'd like to welcome each of you gentlemen to Point of View, and Mr. Smith, we'd like to welcome you to Chattanooga. Mr. Smith, you were the principal speaker at a meeting last Thursday evening, which was sponsored by two ad hoc committees of the John Birch Society. And your principal subject matter was more dangerous than a riot. Could you, in general, tell us what was the essence of your presentation?
Well, the essence of the presentation was that the revolution in America is not taking place in the street. It is taking place in government. The gist of it was that the criminals, whenever they want to rule a nation, always go toward government. And this is what they've done in our country. Basically, what I contend is that the communists have started 100 different movements, or they control 100 movements in the street. The movements are based on, let's say, women's liberation, poverty, race movements, civil rights movements, this sort of business, and that the leaders of these movements always have one solution for every problem. That one solution is a government program. And I contend that if you keep getting more programs down here, and they keep getting more power up at the top, one day you're going to have total programs, and they're going to have total power.
Now, you were quoted as saying that poverty and racism are somewhat false issues in America. Does this mean that they do not exist?
No. First of all, poverty is relative. If I got $10 and you got $5, I'm twice as rich as you are, or else you're twice as poor as I am, if you want to judge it that. The poor will always be with us. It's a relative term. What the communists did was they had a series of marches back in the early 1960s, blaming all of our problems on poverty. And then they installed, once the people looked down and saw the problem in the street, they thought it was poverty causing it, the communists installed a program in the government which was officially entitled the Economic Program of the Communist Party USA, with the subtitle, The War on Poverty. So the action was in the street, and the reaction was in the government. And what they wanted to do was install that program in government. As far as race is concerned, the most obvious thing to look at is the so-called busing business. Busing has been placed on a racial basis. Now, if you think about that a minute, what they have done is they've got Negroes fighting this on a racial basis, whether for, it doesn't matter whether you're for or against it. They've got white people fighting on a racial basis. And while we are like a bunch of fools fighting each other on the basis of race, somebody is trotting off with our kids. And the issue should be government control of children, which is the objective. But they've got the people confused, fighting on the basis of race.
Reverend Griffith, you participated in various civil rights activities. How do you see this whole matter of racism?
I like to go back to a couple of things that were said. One is, Jesus is often misquoted when he said, "The poor will always be with you." This was a statement to his disciples to tell them that they always had an opportunity to serve the poor at a time when he was being anointed with very expensive oil upon his head. And then this idea of Jesus has changed into the idea that there's no hope for the poor. The hope for the poor comes from the church, even if it participates in trying to get government to change. And one of the blessings I feel of our country is that the church has had influence on government, and that government has and does care about the poor. Maybe not enough, but it has and it does. I feel that the real problem on race and poverty has to come with people not looking for one solution, and that is the ability that is in man to love himself and love his neighbor as himself, and above all, to love God. Now, some of us don't believe that we can love our enemy. I think we can.
Mr. Smith, what are your thoughts on the movements of the late Dr. Martin Luther King, his techniques and the kinds of tactics that he used to try to bring about civil rights?
Well, Martin Luther King defined nonviolence. You and I would interpret nonviolence as being the absence of violence, or whatever. But Martin Luther King described it. On April 3rd, 1965, he wrote an article in the Saturday Review of Literature. In there, he described nonviolence. It was a 4-step program. The first step was simply to get a demonstration going, based on a legitimate grievance of whether it's busing or segregation or what. And while he had the Negroes marching, on the other side of town, the other half of the civil rights movement, the white half of it, was out in the white community telling the white people, by God, boys, don't never let them niggas do this. It was a two-edged sword. King had the half going in the Negro community. His counterparts had it going in the white community. They would keep this going until they got a clash between the races. That was step number 2. And King said this was step number 2. As soon as you had the races fighting, then step number 3 took place. These liberals would jump up and cry for legislation and court decisions. And step number 4 was that in this crisis situation, the government would get the legislation and court decisions. King's whole process, nonviolence, was a 4-step program to condition us, that is, to psychologically prepare us to accept socialist legislation and socialist court decisions. He was involved in a conspiracy to convert us into a socialist nation.
So are you saying that his backings did have some kinds of communistic propaganda text to them?
Martin Luther King's backers, when you look at it, and it's about the followers, the backers, on both sides. The James Dombrowskis, the Ann Bradens, the Carl Braden, these are known communists. But as far as the ones who actually financed Martin Luther King, the financing for revolution came from where it always comes from. It came from the Rockefellers and the Fords, the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, people like that. But you see, they're the recipients of power in government. King was advocating more and more government control, more and more government. And of course, every bit of government you got would give them more power in government. And so the recipients of power were the ones who were financing the trouble in the streets so they could receive the power. They weren't interested in Negroes. They were interested in getting power.
Well, what about King himself as a personality? Do you think he was a communist?
I don't think he was a member of the Communist Party. Julia Brown, who was an FBI undercover agent, testified that he was. But I have no documented facts, but it really doesn't matter whether he's a member or not. It's what he did that counts. And of course, he greatly advanced the communist program. What he did, the legislation he promoted, was maybe 1% or 0.5% civil rights, and 99.5% a huge expansion of the bureaucracy in government, a huge expansion of government power. And this, of course, is what the backers were after. Now, King may have been interested in Negro people. I mean, he may have been thinking he was doing something good for us. But you cannot overlook the fact that he greatly increased the power of the federal government, and this is where the threat is coming from above, not from below.
Reverend Griffith, you participated in the march from Selma to Montgomery in 65, I think it was. Of course, this had to do with Martin Luther King and his followers. Did you know at that particular time that you were involved in communist activity?
I had suspicions that there were communists or people who said that they were communists who were shoulder to shoulder. That doesn't mean that I didn't love them as much as I love people who are anti-communist. It doesn't mean that just because communists were involved, and as I assume they were, in a huge gathering like that, there must have been some. But just because they were involved doesn't mean that what was going on was backed by them, supported by them. They were, my feelings are, the Communist Party does just as was mentioned. Where there is a problem, they get themselves involved. And they do try to make the problem clear because they're trying to give leadership to people who are upset in order to convert them to communists. I have the feeling that John Birch Society does the same thing. The exact same thing, and I think the Blue Book says using the tactics of the Communist Party is not illegitimate for the John Birch Society, with front organizations and the rest. And so you get involved where the issues are. And that way you get people to hear your side. It's very hard to get people to come and hear something that isn't worth listening to. And the issue is what they're concerned about. And so you get involved in the issue. And there were people down there trying to influence people. Most of the people I met in Selma were not people being influenced by the John Birch Society, however. I met two kinds of people in Selma. Those who were trying to change the condition under which they were beaten. And I saw beating. And number two, people who wanted to issue those beatings. And then I also saw a group of people feared and respected by both groups, that of the Alabama National Guard and the United States Army.
Oh, wow.
Any reactions?
Yeah, I think I reacted right just with laughter. Actually, we have fronts in the John Birch Society. We have the Support Your Local Police Committees. the Train Committee, which is to restore American independence now. We have the Motor Reed Committee, the Movement to Restore Decency. And we tell everybody that these are ad hoc committees of the John Birch Society. However, you will never find the Communist Party or the so-called liberals admitting that the ACLU is a communist front. Instead, they just try to deny it. You will never find them getting the facts to the American people that the National Lawyers Guild is a communist front. You'll never find them getting the information to the people of who set up the National Council of Churches. Never. They always make like they're humanitarians. You see, the communists have a lot of fronts, but they deny there's any connection between the fronts or between themselves. We believe in being absolutely open. If you want to know what a committee is, if it's connected with the John Birch Society, it says it right there. So, you know, one movement functions in absolute secrecy and cunning with deception. We believe in telling you exactly what we stand for. Secondly, if you think about it a moment, the communists always and everywhere promote more government as a solution to every problem. They promote more government and less individual responsibility. You have to act together, they say. Whereas in the John Birch Society, you'll always find us promoting less government and more individual responsibility. And with God's help, you'll get a better world. When everybody's responsible for their own well-being, each individual, when I take care of my family and you take care of yours to the best of your ability, and we don't interfere with each other, we need less government. But of course, if you can weaken that and make us think you're supposed to get a guaranteed wage, well, that's just turning people into herd animals. And that's what the communists do. There's a gigantic gap. The gap between the John Birch Society, the world we envision, and the world envisioned by the Communist Party and its allies is like night and day. They stand for slavery, and we stand for freedom. They stand for lies, and they say they're going to abolish all truth, and we stand for truth. They stand for the Antichrist. We stand for Christ.
Now, I ask you at this point, how did you become involved with the John Birch Society?
So I was searching for the truth. I had been involved with the Fairfax Cuba Committee, which was a communist front. They didn't say it was a communist front. Back in 1961, 1960. This was the group that Oswald belonged to. Well, I found out I'd been deceived. Well, having been deceived once, I decided I wasn't going to be ignorant anymore. I simply didn't know Castro was a communist. I was honest enough to admit that to myself and to my fellow Americans. I had been deceived and I was deceiving others. So I began searching for the truth. I began to notice connection between what the Communist Party here was doing and backing Castro and how they were backing Martin Luther King and his movement. And I began to ask them questions. And in 1965, I finally met Robert Welch of the John Birch Society, and I began to ask him some questions about what was going on. And it turned out, of course, that he knew basically what I knew, and I believed basically what he believed. He wasn't a racist, he wasn't a fascist, man, somebody any more than I was. Otherwise, I wouldn't have joined. So I joined the John Birch Society. And since that time, I've been taking fact to the people, not fiction, not opinion based on nothing, but fact.
Let's talk about getting back to the revolution.
I'd like to comment on one thing, if I may. Have you ever heard of the Federal Council of Churches?
Yes, I heard of the Federal Council.
The reason I ask the question is because my denomination, the United Presbyterian Church, has had a long history. As far as I know, it's the only church outside the Southern Presbyterian Church that within its very constitution says that one of the functions of the church is to get itself back together. And my church has been very instrumental in the founding of the Federal Council of Churches and very instrumental in the founding of the National Council of Churches. And for years, the National Council of Churches materials used to say at the bottom, printed on the United Presbyterian Press. Now, what I want to say is, it's my opinion that it's the operation of the Holy Spirit trying to bring the world together and this country together that is behind the founding of the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches. There are people who, however, who cannot accept difference within the church, and therefore they would destroy all efforts at unity within Christendom.
Well, I really don't want to talk about the National Council except to say this. You say it was the Holy Spirit. I say it was Andrew Carnegie. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you where this National Council came from. In 1900, the communists, Roger Baldwin and Walter Rauschenbach in that crowd, masquerading, I don't know whether they masqueraded as Presbyterians or not. I don't know what denomination they call themselves.
Andrew Carnegie from birth.
Anyway, Carnegie gave $5 million to establish this thing. In 1905, they changed the name to the Federal Council of Churches. It had this name. In the 1920s, they drew in a segment of the Jewish community and formed offshoot groups, the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Well, this organization, this Federal Council, was so openly pro-communist during the war, because we were on the side of Russia, you see, so they promoted communism like we're helping our Russian brothers. It was so openly communist during the Second World War that after the war, some congressional committees began to investigate it. And when the spotlight was turned on this Federal Council, they reconvened the meetings and renamed themselves the National Council of Churches. They are trying to establish a world religion. That's right. And basically, if you think of history, there was a time in history when the world had one religion. It was the 1,000-year period known as the Dark Ages. And what you're doing is returning the Dark Ages.
Your education comes only from Western society because there's been Hinduism and Buddhism.
I speak of in the Western world.
Judaism was always in the Western world.
I'll put it this way. The 1,000-year period, known as the Dark Ages, was the period when the church was supposed to be supreme.
No, that's when the church was trying to overcome the invasion of the Germanic peoples that overcame the Roman Empire, and the only thing left in civilization was a small group of people, the church. And the rest of the people were at war with each other, sir. I think your interpretation of medieval history is a little off.
What they actually had there was a bunch of kings who kept the people fighting amongst themselves.
No.
You start thinking about that.
If you'll recall, even at the time of Martin Luther, which is very late in the Middle Ages,
you had
a problem in Germany where you didn't have kings. You had princes who was ruled by an old emperor who most of the time was in Spain.
Basically,
so
the Dark Ages.
But the rise of the monarchy came at the very end of the Middle Ages. Prior to that, it was Charlemagne formed an empire out of nothing.
What you had, wait a minute. The Dark Ages basically lasted from 353 to 1453. Okay?
I don't know why you begin 353, but most people begin around 6.
Well, I'm not going to
600 A.D.
Get into that. Okay, with the fall of the empire or whatever.
Right.
But the point I want to make here is that you are reestablishing the same thing. And I'll say what I said before. What's happening in the world today, what's happening here is that somebody is trying to establish a world government. And as part of that world government, a world religion. And they are not, I'll put it this way, the communists are not interested in destroying God. I mean, your religion.
That's a little difficult to do.
No, the communists are not interested in destroying religion. What they seek to do is to replace God in the church with Satan. They seek to replace the gospel of Christ with the gospel of Karl Marx. Now, the gospel of Christ, of course, teaches individual salvation. But the gospel of Marx
also teaches redemption of the world.
Fine.
But that means a world religion.
Oh my goodness. You know something? You come as individuals. You always come as individuals. You know, to go out there and, must redeem the whole world. That's that bleeding heart business. And that's that baloney that got everybody messed up. But if
then that's about 75% of the New Testament.
Let me ask you a question. You ever read the Communist Manifesto?
Way back when I was in junior college.
All right, then you remember that Karl Marx had a 10-point program for destroying the United States. If you read it in junior college, you'd never forget it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that program? Do you remember any of the points in the program? Any points at all? Okay, I've got a copy of the Communist Manifesto. In the John Birch Society, we sell this. Not because we want to sell you communism, but because we think if any honest person reads the manifesto and looks at the 10-point program, he'll recognize what's going on. I'll call your attention to 3 of the points, which apparently you've forgotten. The second point in his manifesto is a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Now, of course, some people would insist that the income tax didn't come from Karl Marx, but it did, right here in the manifesto. The third point is the abolition of all right of inheritance, and the 5th point in the manifesto is what is now called the Federal Reserve Bank. But the point I want to make is this. If you look at the men, the Senator, Nelson Aldrich, who introduced the income tax, if you look at how that tax was put through, if you look at how the Federal Reserve Bank was put through, and look at the men involved in that, and start investigating them, what you're going to discover is that these also were the men, Nick Carnegie was in there, who formed that so-called National Council of Churches, your organization, and who also financed Lenin and Trotsky. What I'm trying to get across here is that communism is not a rising of the masses. What these men have done, these super rich, you want to call them that? I don't care what you call them, state capitalists, monopoly capitalists, call them what you want. They have been financing communism around the world, and they're also financing social discontent in our country, pretending to be interested in the welfare of the people. This is the biggest pretense of history. And then they pretend that communism is a rising of the masses, and that the people want socialism and can't have it because the big guys won't give it to them. I'm suggesting that you need to get down and start studying what this communist business is and start asking yourself, who installed the programs in our government? And start asking, don't question your motivation. Start questioning the motivations of the men who've been setting these different things up. Because you might be trying to help the people. King might have been trying to help the Negro people. But it turns out, let's say, that he thought he was using them, that he's using the communists. Maybe the communists were using him instead. If you know what the communist program is, and you ask yourself, did they benefit by it? Maybe you'll get some answers. I have a book here, matter of fact, explaining exactly that. And I gave you a copy of it. None dare call it conspiracy. It's the fastest-selling book in publishing history. And it simply documents who financed Lenin and Trotsky, where they get the money. You start asking those kind of questions. Who financed Mao Zedong? Who put him in there? And it turns out, of course, that it was financed not out of China, not out of Russia. It was financed out of England, out of the United States, by the very same guys who set up your ACLU, the National Council of Churches, the NAACP, the Urban League, the SDS. And I'm saying that these movements that have been set up here, while the ordinary person gets in there thinking he's helping the people, I'm saying that you're being betrayed. Your best motivation doesn't amount to nothing if you've been enlisted in an army, which in effect is destroying the country. This book is available from American Opinion Bookstore. You have one here in Chattanooga, and we have them all around the country. Or you can get it from the John Birch Society in Belmont, Massachusetts. Everybody should get a copy of this book. And then just start asking questions. And as I said, opinion should be based on fact, not on suspicion or misinformation, just on fact. And once you get the facts, then you can say, yes, if you want to agree with the National Council, that's your own business. If you want to disagree, that's your own business. If you want to agree with the ACLU, that's your own business. But base your information on fact. Who set it up and for what purpose? Read what they actually said. And then you'll begin to see what's going on there. I don't want to condemn anybody, except to say that I want you all to get the book and base your information on fact. And I think you'll change your mind next week about what you're saying today.
About what? You mean about who founded the Council of Church?
No, I think you'll change your whole inclination about getting the church involved in these so-called social movements and stuff. And I also think you'll change your mind and your whole opinion about the John Birch Society. As a matter of fact, I think that if you read the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, you will discover, and I don't think you'll find anything in there in the John Birch Society Blue Book that you can disagree with.
Wait, excuse me. You think it's if there is poverty, that it's wrong for the church that claims to be the ministering body of Christ, both biblically and post-biblically, to be involved in feeding the poor,
Frankly,
healing the needs of the sick?
Frankly, I don't care what you get involved in the church. What I'm saying is that when you promote government involvement, you're promoting the destruction of America, and that's what you're promoting. It's one thing for you to want to go out and collect monies and whatever and buy food and feed the poor. That's your own business. But when you're advocating government control or government programs, you, in effect, under the guise of meeting the needs of the poor, what you're doing is installing a program. Every program put in increases the size of the government and the reach of government and the power of government. I'm warning you of the danger of your own folly. If you keep doing that and get programs down here, no matter what your intentions are, you keep getting programs down here and you keep pushing power up there, one day you're going to discover that you've got total programs and they got total power. And then is when you're going to discover what you've done to yourself. I'm trying to warn you against your own virtue. I'm not saying you're not interested in the poor. Maybe you want to help the poor. That's your own business. Maybe you want to help solve race problems. That's your own business.
But don't let the government help the poor.
Don't get the government.
Don't let the people united together in a representative democracy to help the poor.
Hold it a second. This is a republic, not a democracy.
Okay, in a representative constitutional republic, people shouldn't get together to help the poor.
Wait a minute. People can get together.
Using a structure that they determined and that they're loyal to, they should not be able to use that structure to help the poor.
I should like for you to show me anywhere in the Constitution where the government has any business tampering with schools or providing any kind of welfare or anything else. That is not the function of government. In our constitutional republic, the government is limited, absolutely limited. Federal powers are delegated, and nowhere in there was any authority delegated to do the things it is now doing.
Now,
nowhere.
Excuse me. I believe that depends on your interpretation of the General Welfare Clause, which is
No, it depends on. It says to promote the general welfare, not to provide it.
Well,
But you know the difference between the words?
wait a minute. No, yeah, I do.
In other words, the idea is to make it so that all of us can get along
It doesn't say that
fine.
you can't promote it by providing it either.
Hold it a second.
It doesn't say that as your way of
It
promoting.
does. You know what it says?
In other words, all I'm saying is that you and the tradition of the justices of the Supreme Court disagree, and you have a right to disagree.
Wait a
with
minute
them.
now. I know what the communists have done is they seized on that. That's the so-called expansion clause of the Constitution. And, of course, that's in the
That's what
preamble.
some scholars
To promote-
called it.
But scholars, not a bunch of communist traitors, what they've been. Selling a specious idea that the government's supposed to do this. The only legitimate function of government is to protect the life and property of citizens.
Excuse me,
Not to
did
do
you
anything
say
else.
that all of the justices of the Supreme Court, the great majority, are communist with something?
No, I said those scholars who have interpreted it like you wanted it interpreted, that so they can get in there and provide all the welfare stuff. Those scholars have been a bunch
You
of
call it an
traitors.
expansionist clause. And that's a scholarly term. I'm
That's
saying that
the term they use.
The Supreme Court doesn't use that term, but the Supreme Court has interpreted it
I said
to
those-
mean that these programs are legitimate.
The
Is that
Supreme
correct
Court,
or incorrect?
The Supreme Court does not have that function. And what I'm saying here is that if you look at the guys on the Supreme Court, you'll find that the court is operating under this communist doctrine that the Constitution says whatever the Supreme Court says it says. And I ask the question then, what's the Constitution for?
Will you please name
That's the Frankfurter doctrine.
Will you please name those justices on the Supreme Court who advocate communist doctrine?
All 9 of them. Every one of them up there. Every one of them up there is advocating that. That's right.
And
There
I'm
isn't-
sure that
there
they
isn't
would
a loyal-
disagree with you.
Listen, I'll tell you what. All we'd have to do is take a look at what communist doctrine actually was. Now, I said opinions should be based on fact. Take a look at what communist doctrine actually is, what they actually advocate, and then look at what the justices are doing. And compare what the communists actually advocate with what they're doing, and make your own judgment. I'm basing what I say on a careful reading of what the communist plots and the plans actually are. See, I got the manifesto here, which I make sure I don't forget what's in there.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, since you read it so long ago, you might have forgotten.
Yeah, but my
See?
question is still the same. If these men are communists,
I didn't say they were communists.
if they are advocating communist doctrine and seeing that it is
They most
put
certainly are.
into effect,
They most certainly are.
okay? Now, if they're doing that, do you consider that treason?
I most certainly, I'll put it this way, I certainly consider it treason. That's right.
Okay, then I want to ask, why don't you or the John Birch Society do the same thing that groups like the American Civil Liberties Union does and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People does? When they have a beef that looks like a legal problem, they institute action in the courts. And they...
Let me tell you why.
Sure.
Because what's happened in our country is the justices have become a bunch of Pharisees. We haven't got justice in this country anymore. What you got is a bunch of traitors sitting on the Supreme Courts and sitting on the high places, and they make determinations always ruling against the United States. Such a simple matter as so-called busing. Congress passed a law in 1964 which said no section of the act would empower any court or any official to bring about forced busing for the purpose of racial balance. Congress makes the laws, not the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court going to turn around and put in forced busing. I'm saying that that's sedition. What we have to do is get the people in this country educated to the point where we get good congressmen. Congress has the power to impeach those justices.
Would you suggest, then, that the congressmen, senators, and House of Representative congressmen in this,
Reverend
from this
Griffith.
area take impeachment actions against all the justices?
Gentlemen, remember me? We're going to have to close this discussion. I'm sorry we don't have an hour to go today. But it's a real interesting topic. I'm pretty sure that we can discuss this more and more. But I'd like to thank each of you gentlemen for being on Point of View today. And this was a real unique program. Our guest today have been Mr. Charles Smith, who is a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and who